I'm not suggesting Queen Camilla lacks authority, but that tiara isn't hers. It rightfully belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, for the Christmas gala at Buckingham,
King Alaric had ruled the Kingdom of Vaeland for 11 years, and in all that time, no one in his household had ever heard his sister raise her voice. Princess Rowena did not need to. On the evening the family gathered in the small library behind the state rooms, one sentence from her was enough to silence a room that had heard every kind of royal secret before, but nothing quite like this. She said that the regalia worn at the winter court belonged, by right, not to Queen Isolde, but to Alara, the wife of Crown Prince Corwin. The old walls of Ashford Keep had absorbed decades of quiet arguments, but they had never absorbed a claim so bold, spoken so plainly, by someone so rarely willing to speak at all. King Alaric did not answer at once. He sat with one hand resting on the arm of his chair, his face heavy with something deeper than surprise. He had, in fact, been waiting for someone to say aloud what he had spent 2 years preparing in private, a plan to move the emotional weight of the crown toward his son and daughter-in-law, not as a distant inheritance but as a living, present responsibility. Rowena had simply been the one willing to break the silence that had protected everyone, including him, for far too long. She spoke that night the way someone speaks when they have carried a truth for a long time and have finally set it down. The king, she said, had not merely wondered about the future of Vaeland. He had planned for it. The crown, the great and simple word that stood for duty, continuity, and the trust of an entire kingdom, was being prepared to shift toward Corwin and Alara long before the country would be ready to hear it announced. Succession law had always been written in clear, dry language. What Rowena was describing was not law. It was confidence, the fragile thing law could never fully protect. Alaric listened to his sister without interrupting. He understood why her words sounded harsh to the others in the room. He also understood, more painfully than anyone, why they had become necessary. For months he had watched the kingdom's confidence circle the throne like weather building over the coast, and every time it did, he felt the years of silence he had kept pressing down on him. He had watched his own health falter in small, private ways. He had watched the machinery of court life continue as though nothing were changing, even as everything was. Rowena had watched too. She had seen her brother carry the weight of illness he rarely spoke of, the pressure of holding a fracturing family together, and the loneliness that comes from believing duty alone can hold everything in place. But duty, she had learned, has limits. The king had begun to fear, quietly and then less quietly, that Vaeland's monarchy could not survive another generation shaped by hesitation and uncertainty. So he had looked toward his son not as someone arriving from a distance, but as the future already standing in the room. He had looked toward Alara not as decoration beside that future, but as its strength. Corwin received the truth of his father's plan the way a man receives a blow he has long expected but can never quite prepare for. He understood, better than most, what it meant to become the emotional center of a monarchy before the crown had officially touched his head. Alara understood it too, and understood something more, that she would not simply stand beside her husband in this new arrangement. She would become part of the answer the kingdom needed, whether she had asked for that role or not. Their composure, their discipline, the picture their small family made in public, had stopped being a private matter of reputation. It had become something closer to the survival of the institution itself. It was Rowena's final admission that struck hardest. The king, she revealed, had already discussed with his closest advisors how Corwin and Alara might be placed at the center of major decisions long before any formal transition was ever announced to the public. Alaric had not acted from ambition, and he had certainly not acted from any diminished love for his wife. He had acted from fear, the fear that waiting too long would leave the crown exposed at the exact moment the kingdom needed it to look steady. As Rowena's words settled over the room, everyone understood a harder truth beneath the first one. This decision would lift 2 people forward, but it would also leave someone else standing quietly in the shadow of that lift. Every decision made at the level of a crown carries both a public face and a private cost. For Alaric, this had never been only about who would inherit the throne. For Corwin, it was a burden arriving before his heart had fully prepared to carry it. For Alara, it was a call to stand taller while the entire kingdom watched to see if she would falter. And for Queen Isolde, it was something colder than any of that, the sudden, undeniable sense that history was moving forward without waiting for her permission. Alaric knew the crown had to appear steady even while the family behind it felt close to breaking apart. He had spent long nights weighing duty against damage, legacy against survival, and silence against the plain truth. The crown could not afford confusion at the exact moment the kingdom most needed certainty. That was why Rowena's words landed with such force. She had not been spreading rumor through the halls of Ashford Keep. She had been explaining, in plain and difficult language, the fear her brother had carried alone for months. The monarchy needed a future the people could already trust, not one they would have to be convinced of after the fact. Corwin felt the weight of that truth but did not reach for it eagerly. He understood how dangerous a single wrong response could be in a room like this one. If he accepted the plan too readily, it would look like ambition. If he pulled away too firmly, it would look like weakness, or worse, like disloyalty to a father who had clearly agonized over the decision. So he stayed quiet, holding himself with the same discipline his father had come to rely on in him over the years. Alaric watched his son's stillness closely, and in that stillness he found something like reassurance. Corwin was not chasing power. He was trying to understand what power would demand of him, and of the people he loved. Alara carried a different kind of fear that evening. She understood this was not simply a matter of public duty settling onto her husband's shoulders. It would touch their children, their marriage, and every quiet, ordinary moment of privacy they still had left. She understood that the influence being offered to them was not a gift wrapped in honor, as it might appear from the outside. It was a burden wrapped carefully in expectation. Alaric trusted her precisely because she had endured pressure before without ever turning it into spectacle, and that quiet strength had become, over time, impossible for the court to overlook. Rowena had seen it before most others were willing to admit it. She had watched Corwin remain calm during a difficult season for the kingdom, when confidence in the crown had wavered. She had watched Alara hold the family's public image together when everyone around her looked shaken by circumstance. The princess understood why her brother had begun to see the two of them as the strongest shield the monarchy possessed, not because they were flawless, but because they were steady, and in a royal house surrounded by strain, steadiness had become worth more than popularity ever could. Isolde sensed the shift the moment the conversation turned toward Corwin and Alara. She gripped the edge of the table and said nothing at first, though the silence itself said a great deal. She understood, without needing the words spelled out, that the future of the household was being shaped around someone else's strength. Alaric did not look away from her pain, but neither did he reverse what he had already decided. Beneath his silence sat the real and difficult question that the family would spend the rest of that night circling: what had happened, in the months before this evening, that made the king believe time itself had begun working against him. There was one night the family rarely spoke of afterward, at least not openly. It had not happened before an audience or during any grand ceremony. It had happened after a tense private gathering at the old hunting lodge, when a senior advisor brought Alaric a sealed report on public confidence, family division, and the fragile future of the crown. By the time the king finished reading it, he looked, according to those present, noticeably older than he had that morning. He did not ask for comfort. He asked instead for the room to be cleared. The report was no ordinary summary of court business. It had been prepared quietly after a gathering meant to project family unity to the wider kingdom. That gathering had been meant to show strength, but the numbers behind the smiles told a different story. Public confidence was leaning more and more heavily toward Corwin and Alara, while the older structure around the throne looked, in the advisor's careful phrasing, tired and uncertain. Alaric read every line slowly, understanding the warning beneath the measured language. If he delayed preparing a clear future for his son and daughter-in-law, the kingdom risked entering its next difficult season without any trusted emotional center at all. This mattered because a crown can survive criticism. It cannot survive confusion. People need to believe the family knows where it is going, even when the family itself is still wounded. The final page of that report was the one that changed him. It named Alara as a stabilizing presence, not because she demanded attention, but because she brought calm into rooms that had grown used to tension. She had become the kind of figure who could soften fear in others and make the wider kingdom believe its future was safe in her hands and her husband's. Alaric understood the power in that observation, and he understood its cost as well. To move the crown's future so visibly toward his son and daughter-in-law was, in a sense, to admit that his own remaining years on the throne were already being measured against what would come after them. Rowena found him later that night, still seated, still silent in the lodge's small study. She did not rush him. She knew her brother too well for that. She could see plainly that he was not chasing drama, and he was certainly not trying to punish anyone in the family for the choices they had made. He was facing something far more painful, the plain fact of mortality, duty, and the slow, indifferent passage of time. A monarch can wear a crown for decades, she understood, but no monarch can stop the clock ticking beneath it. Her brother, that night, looked like a man who had finally, fully heard it. That private moment became, in the months that followed, the turning point Alaric could no longer set aside. He had gone into the gathering at the lodge hoping the family could continue holding together under its old shape. He left it knowing a new shape was required, and required soon. Corwin and Alara were no longer simply heirs waiting somewhere in the distance of the future. They had become, whether anyone had planned it consciously or not, the shield the family needed for the present moment. That was why the quiet after the report felt so dangerous to everyone who sensed it. A private concern was becoming royal planning, and royal planning, once it exists on paper, has a way of becoming emotional reality whether anyone is ready for it or not. The file may have started the shift, but it was a face-to-face conversation, weeks later, that turned quiet preparation into an open family crisis. That confrontation did not begin with raised voices. It began with the small, sharp sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Isolde stood first. Alaric remained seated. Rowena watched from the side of the room, her expression carefully unreadable. Corwin kept his hands folded in his lap while Alara lowered her eyes just long enough to hide whatever she was feeling. Everyone in that room understood, without needing to be told, that the crown was not only choosing a future that evening. It was exposing every fear each of them had been quietly carrying. Isolde turned to face her husband with the kind of hurt that does not require tears to look devastating. She asked him, plainly, whether the years she had spent beside him now meant less than the public image of his son and daughter-in-law. She had stood through scandal, through public judgment, through the ordinary pressures of a life lived in front of an entire kingdom. Now she felt history shifting away from her, and Alaric could not pretend, not to her and not to himself, that he did not see it happening. Alaric looked at her, then looked down at the folder resting on the table between them. He understood that this private meeting mattered because it was the first time the plan had been spoken about without the softening language that had protected everyone until now. Expanded responsibility for Corwin and Alara was no longer a distant idea discussed only among advisors. It was becoming a real, walked path, and the king understood the damage that path might cause even as he understood the greater danger of refusing to walk it at all. Corwin chose his words with care, though even his silence carried weight in that room. He did not want to wound his father, and he did not want to appear eager for a power he had not asked to receive so soon. Alara felt that same tension sitting beside him. She understood that her name had become part of a decision capable of dividing the family even as it steadied the kingdom around them. She had never asked to become the answer to anyone's uncertainty. Yet her father-in-law had, over time, come to see her exactly that way. It was Rowena who finally spoke, and the room changed the moment she did. She made clear, as plainly as she could, that Alaric had not chosen Corwin and Alara out of favoritism. He had chosen them because he believed the kingdom needed a future its people could already trust before it arrived. She had stayed quiet long enough, she said, to know the difference between ambition and survival, and what she was watching her brother do was not the former. Alaric removed his glasses and set them down beside the folder, a small gesture that carried more weight than any speech could have. He admitted, for the first time aloud, that none of this had been sudden. He had watched the kingdom turn toward Corwin during moments of difficulty. He had watched Alara hold her place when pressure might easily have broken someone less steady. He had watched his own sister measure the truth carefully and say nothing until saying nothing became more dangerous than speaking. Isolde did not answer right away. She understood, in that silence, what had just been confirmed for everyone in the room. Affection alone had not been enough to decide the shape of the future. Years of loyalty had not been enough to stop the shift already underway. Alaric still cared for her, deeply and without pretense, but the crown was demanding something colder than comfort from all of them. It was demanding protection, for the institution and for the kingdom it served, and once that emotion had broken fully to the surface, the harder question could no longer be avoided: who, in the end, truly held power over the future of a crown like this one? Royal power rarely announces itself with any thunder. More often it arrives through a lowered voice, a folded note, a private conversation held behind a closed door. Alaric understood that better than almost anyone in the kingdom. Rowena understood it too. The decision to move the crown's future toward Corwin and Alara was not only an emotional choice. It was a strategic one, and behind that strategy stood the single force no palace, however old or proud, can ever fully ignore: the need to survive whatever comes next. Alaric felt the particular loneliness of leadership settle over him before he ever picked up a pen to make anything official. He knew his own authority still mattered in the eyes of the kingdom, but it was no longer shaped by tradition alone. Health, workload, public confidence, and the plain question of continuity had stopped being private concerns discussed quietly among family. They had become forces pressing in on the crown from every direction, and the king could feel each one closing in a little further with each passing season. Rowena watched him with the steady eyes of a sister who had seen enough hardship not to be easily moved by any single moment. She understood, better than most, why this decision mattered so much. If the family waited until a genuine crisis forced its hand, the shift toward Corwin and Alara would look desperate, even panicked, to a watching kingdom. If Alaric prepared for it early, however painful that preparation felt in private, it could look controlled instead. He signed the private planning note not long after that conversation, pausing for a long moment before setting his name beneath the decision. It was not a public announcement. It was a quiet internal step, a written signal that the future roles of his son and daughter-in-law needed to be strengthened before events outran the family's ability to shape them. Corwin was not being handed the crown in one dramatic gesture. He was being positioned, carefully and deliberately, as the future center of trust and visible leadership for the kingdom. Alara stood beside that future in a way Alaric could no longer treat as incidental. She had shown emotional discipline during a season when,